During the period of all these reform movements, which again coincide with the market revolution and the rise of the white man's democracy, in the middle of all these reform movements, you also come up with something that historians have called the discovery of the asylum. And these would be asylums for people who were poor, asylums for people who were prisoners, asylums for people who were mentally ill, and not exactly asylums, but schools for those who were blind and who were deaf. This was this discovery of the asylum was an optimistic movement because reformers were thinking that if a program of education, moral suasion, and behavior modification could work to keep societies functioning smoothly, and they had seen that with the temperance movement, and they'd seen that with some of the previous reform movements, maybe this same program could be adapted to help those individuals who could not or would not function effectively in a wider society. So the idea of people being paupers, of people being permanently poor, um, or of being criminals, or of being what were then called lunatics, this was no longer viewed as inevitable. And so the place where these programs of trying to assist these people, to rehabilitate them, where these things were carried out were typically called an asylum, a controlled environment where new methods of taking care of these people could be attempted. And the first of these that I want to discuss is prison reform. And you might remember that Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote this book, Democracy in America, for which he's most famous, to talk about democracy and tyranny of the majority and sort of the good parts and the bad parts, the ugly parts of democracy as he perceived it. His actual job when he came from France was to examine the prison reform movement in the United States. And so, among other things, he would have seen um, various new prison systems. And of these, the two best known were the Auburn system and the Philadelphia system. Philadelphia is a city, obviously, you know that it's in Pennsylvania. Auburn is a much smaller city. It is located in New York. So until the 1820s and 1830s, criminals were usually dealt with either by corporal punishment or by death. Lengthy prison terms were rare. And the purpose of punishment, or sorry, the purpose of punishment was simply that, to punish. Rehabilitation was not a goal. Well, the Auburn system, did attempt to rehabilitate um, prisoners. One of the themes that you see throughout the discovery of the asylum movement is that people's lives were needed to be arranged, that they were deranged, or disarranged, or whatever, and then if you could fix this, you could create lives that were arranged. And so, if you think about a deranged person, the way that we use it nowadays, it comes back to this discovery of the asylum period. And of course, it's applied to people who are mentally ill, if you want to be pejorative about it, and particularly deranged in the sense of somebody who's sort of criminally, mentally ill. So the way the Auburn system worked was to put the prisoners to work in a supervised environment. And what you can see here are prisoners, they're heading off to work, and they're heading off to work in formation. Specifically, the way that's often work is that um, you'd put your hand on the shoulder of the fellow in front of you, and you would kind of shuffle along from, uh, you know, sort of the cells where you were being housed off to work. And the thing about the Auburn system is that it was social. You were around people, you were doing productive work, and so on. This Auburn system, by the way, ended up working pretty well. The Philadelphia system, on the other hand, emphasized solitary confinement. And the emphasis was on, okay, we're going to give this person time by themselves to reflect on what they've done and to sort of have a sense of guilt for what they've done sort of permeate them. And and this would be a good thing for them. This, once they had a chance to sort of reflect on what they'd done and this kind of thing, they would reform, they would get better. Well, what happened was it drove them crazy. And so the Philadelphia system did not work out very well, except as a particularly severe form of punishment. Nowadays, if you're in a prison and you're placed in solitary confinement, that is intended to punish in a particularly draconian kind of way. So that's the contribution that the Philadelphia system made to our penal system today. And of course, the other thing about the Philadelphia system is that the idea of penitentiary, where you're penitent, that's where the term comes from. So what you're talking about here with prison reform, we talk about prototypes of the criminal justice system. So the penitentiary, correctional facility, and so on. And then is now the effectiveness of these systems were disputed. They're disputed now. One problem is a basic faulty assumption. And the assumption was that people are what's called tabula rasa. They're just sort of like blank slates on to which, when they're young, they could have, they can be around a bad environment and they can get involved with criminal activity, and then that's what's put on their slates, their blank slates. And then what you can do in prison is you can erase that blank slate and put something better on it. Well, this assumes that people are infinitely malleable. Well, people are, as we've discovered, are not infinitely malleable. And so the optimistic, conceptions of prisons as they were put forth by reformers, and then you have, legislators and state houses signing off on these new kinds of prisons. These, what the reformers promised failed to deliver. And so what you get down the line are prisons that are allowed to run down, to decay, prisoners that are regarded as sort of beyond redemption. You have guards that are allowed to be cruel. You have prisons where corruption runs rampant, and so forth. But these all track from the disappointment over the optimistic vision of prison reform that was put forth um, by the prison reformers. Next, you have what were then called insane asylums. And people, put it this way, until the 20th century, until well into the 20th century, by and large, the medical understanding of what we now call mental illness or mental disorders or whatever was primitive. And the theories that we had about what caused mental illness, how you could cure mental illness, and so on, were problematic to say the least. And one response to this was sort of basically just despair. Um, you know, you got crazy Aunt Florence, and she creates lots of problems. So you sort of chain her up in the attic. That's an extreme example. But what you would most likely do is turn her over to a quote unquote a hospital like Bethlem Hospital in London. This is an engraving from the early 18th century, and essentially people who were mentally ill were simply just warehoused. And you could go in there if you wanted to, and you could pretend to be a reformer interested in these kinds of things, and you could just watch people just be crazy because there wasn't anything to be done with them. And so you would see them talking to themselves or banging their heads against the wall or doing all kinds of bonkers kinds of things, and there was just nothing to be done to help them. And there is a phrase that has come down to us today, Bedlam. Bedlam was a nickname for Bethlehem Hospital. And so Bedlam is basically a state of chaos. Oh my gosh, it's absolute bedlam out on the field, as OSU students rush onto the field after the Michigan victory to tear down the goalposts and this kind of thing. So Bedlam has become a synonym for that. And insane asylums in the United States they weren't asylums yet. You had these mental hospitals, and they weren't much better. Well, how do you help people who are mentally ill? Well, the first step actually is to see them as human beings who are mentally ill, or as was called back then, insane. There's to say you have people who are sane, sanity, and then you have people who are not, who are not sane. They're insane. Well, how do you fix such people? Well, you've got inventions by that, say, of Dr. Benjamin Rush, famous guy in Philadelphia. Did was interested in a lot of things. We could go on and on forever about Dr. Benjamin Rush, but one of the things that was a common belief the time that Benjamin Rush lived, and that was in the late 18th century, early 19th century, was was thought that, well, insanity takes place in the human brain. So what's probably happening is that enough blood is not getting to the human brain. That mental illness really is a physical illness. It's an arterial disease. It's an inflammation of the brain. And so what Benjamin Rush invented was something called the tranquilizer chair. And what you see on the left is a tranquilizer chair at Colonial Williamsburg, um, replete with, notice at the bottom, a chamber pot, because you're going to be there for a while if you're in the tranquilizer chair. And this chair, they put you in it, and your vision is restricted, and you can't go anywhere, and so forth. So you're tranquilized. If you're ever really feeling agitated and so forth, just fix yourself up a chair that looks like this and sit in it, and you're going to be just nice and tranquilized. Well, the sense was that this chair was supposed to control the flow of blood toward the brain, and by lessening muscular action or by reducing motor activity, you would reduce the force and frequency of the pulse, and therefore how fast the blood was getting to the brain, and that this would improve one's mental health. Well, you can imagine how well that worked. So the next step really are these insane asylums, and these were designed to cure inmates, not just to confine them. And sort of the menu of options in terms of helping to cure uh, people who are mentally ill is broader than putting them all in tranquilizer chairs. No, the assumption was that people who are mentally ill, their lives were once again deranged, and the goal, through isolation from the pressures of society, the creation of an environment of order and quiet and routine, was to arrange their lives anew in ways that were, at a minimum, bearable, and then hopefully would allow them to become functioning members of society. Well, there are two problems, and I've already mentioned to one of them, was that you have a very imperfect grasp of mental illness. And so, so reformers like Dorothea Dix on the left there, for whom Dorothea Dix Hospital, that's the one behind me, is named, she worked for 30 years to improve conditions. And she went around the country and talked to state legislatures of, and told sort of horror stories about inmates being kept in chains and in closets. And I'm quoting here from something she wrote: chained, naked, beaten with rods, and lashed into obedience. And she basically said, there is a better way to do this. And one of them is to put these individuals, who are insane or deranged, put them in hospitals where we can work to arrange their lives and to restore them to sanity. And legislators, around the country bought into this and said, this sounds like, like a good idea. And they built nice looking insane hospitals like the one in Indianapolis, or like the original North Carolina Hospital for the Insane, which is the precursor to Dorothea Dix Hospital. And then guess what happened? Well, the mentally ill in these facilities did not get better, and legislators appropriated less and less money for these institutions. They became once again places where the insane were housed, were warehoused, were not given any kind of treatment because what kind of it was clear, we have no idea what kind of treatment to give them. Maybe they're untreatable, and and these places became sort of worse and worse, and by the way persisted that way until the late 1950s, early 1960s, when you had a movement to take mentally ill people and deinstitutionalize them, put them out on the streets in a sense that they would do at least as well on the streets as they were doing in these institutions. That didn't work out so great either. If you're walking around, around High Street and in the campus area, and you hear people talking to themselves, and they're actually talking to themselves and not talking on their iPhone. These are people who have schizophrenia. They have never been in an institution, or maybe they were once upon a time, and they've been deinstitutionalized, and they're out on the street, ostensibly, able to take care of themselves, but really not, not in fact. To this day, mental illness is not really well treated in this country. If you have the money, yeah. If you don't have the money, not so much. But the attempt during the era of these reform movements, you know, was laudable, and it was a step forward in terms of at least seeing these people with mental illnesses as human beings, as people just like you and me. And that in itself was a significant step forward.